The small town of Eldermore had always been a quiet place, nestled deep in the misty woods where time seemed to move slower. On most nights, the streets would fall silent by 10, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But on this particular night, the stillness felt different, heavy, as though the darkness itself was holding its breath. Ella Harper sat in her living room, nursing a cup of chamomile tea as the antique grandfather clock chimed midnight. The sound echoed through her old, creaky home, a comforting rhythm she'd grown used to over the years. The house had been in her family for generations, each corner filled with memories and stories. Tonight, however, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a watchtower perched on the edge of something unknown. Just as she reached to turn off the lamp and head to bed, there was a knock at the door. Ella froze. No one came to her house at this hour, no one ever had. Her closest neighbor lived nearly a mile away, and visitors to Eldermore were rare. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Rising cautiously, Ella approached the door, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but the inky blackness of the night. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, only silence. And then, a whisper, "Ella, let me in." Ella Harper lived a life as predictable as the tides. At 42, she had settled into a rhythm that suited her, far away from the bustling city life she'd left behind a decade ago. She spent her days restoring antiques, repairing delicate heirlooms in her cozy workshop, and her evenings with books, tea, and the soothing crackle of her fireplace. Eldermore was the kind of place that felt untouched by time. The streets were lined with cobblestones, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and its Victorian-style homes seemed to whisper secrets of a bygone era. Ella's house, perched on the edge of the woods, was one of the oldest in town. It had belonged to her grandmother, a stern but kind woman who'd often spoken of the Watchers of the Woods with a reverence Ella had never fully understood. Though she adored the peace Eldermore offered, Ella couldn't deny the peculiar stories that seemed woven into its fabric. Tales of strange figures seen at the forest's edge, of doors creaking open on windless nights, and of soft, persistent knocks in the dead of night. Eldermore's charm came with an undercurrent of mystery, a quiet unease that the locals seldom discussed openly. On this particular evening, the air carried an unnatural chill. Ella had spent the afternoon repairing a fragile porcelain doll brought in by one of her rare customers. The doll, with its wide, glassy eyes and faded dress, had unnerved her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Its owner, an elderly man with shaking hands, had warned her, "Be careful with this one, it's older than it looks." As dusk settled, Ella had locked the doll away in her workshop and retreated to her living room. She tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but found herself glancing at the windows more often than usual. The knock at midnight shattered her thoughts. Standing by the door, Ella's heart raced. The whisper, soft, barely audible, seemed to seep through the wood like smoke. "Ella?" She tried to peer through the peephole again, but saw nothing but darkness. A part of her wanted to bolt the door and retreat to her bedroom, but another part, a dangerous mix of curiosity and unease, urged her to open it. Gathering her courage, she flicked the porch light switch. The bulb sputtered, casting brief flashes of light before plunging the porch back into shadow. Taking a deep breath, Ella unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. The night stretched before her, silent and still. The porch was empty. "Hello," she called again, stepping onto the creaky wooden planks. The cold bit at her skin, sending a shiver up her spine. As she turned to go back inside, she noticed something on the porch, a small object lying near the welcome mat. Picking it up, she realized it was a piece of folded paper. The edges were singed, and a faint scent of smoke clung to it. Unfolding it carefully, she read the scrawled words. "It's watching you." Her breath hitched. She scanned the yard and the tree line beyond, but nothing moved. The woods, bathed in moonlight, stood silent. Back inside, Ella locked the door and drew the curtains, her mind racing. The note could have been a prank, kids trying to scare her perhaps, but something about it felt too deliberate, too personal. She placed the note on the coffee table and sat back in her chair, trying to steady her nerves. The clock ticked loudly, filling the silence of the room. Just as she began to relax, a faint tapping echoed from the direction of the workshop. Her workshop was connected to the house by a short hallway. Its door always kept closed when she wasn't working. Rising slowly, Ella made her way toward the sound, her footsteps hesitant. The tapping grew louder as she approached, sharp and rhythmic. It stopped the moment her hand touched the doorknob. "Hello," she whispered, pushing the door open. The workshop was just as she'd left it, with tools neatly arranged and the porcelain doll resting on the workbench. But something felt off. The air was colder, heavier. The doll's head, which she was certain had been tilted downward, now faced straight ahead. Its glass eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light. A sudden knock echoed through the house, louder than before. This time, it came from the back door. Ella turned, her pulse quickening. She was no longer alone. The knock at the back door sent a jolt through Ella, her instinct screaming to lock every door and window in the house. But something else, a gnawing sense of inevitability, compelled her to investigate. Clutching her phone tightly, she crept down the hallway toward the kitchen, where the back door stood shrouded in shadows. The knock came again, louder and more forceful this time. "Who's there?" Ella called, her voice trembling. No response. The doorknob rattled as if someone was testing it. Her heart pounded as she flicked on the outdoor light. Through the glass pane, she could see the porch clearly now, but it was empty. Summoning what little courage she had, Ella unlocked the door and pulled it open, peering into the night. A sharp gust of wind blew past her, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. The porch was bare, save for a single item resting on the step, the porcelain doll. Ella stared at it, her mind reeling. She had locked the doll in her workshop. How could it possibly be outside? Bending down, she hesitated before picking it up. The doll felt colder than before, its glass eyes reflecting the dim porch light. There was something unsettlingly lifelike about its expression, as though it were watching her. Carrying the doll inside, Ella placed it on the kitchen table, keeping a wary distance. She checked the workshop, finding the door still locked and the room undisturbed. A chill ran through her as she realized there was no logical explanation for what had just happened. The next day, Ella tried to shake off the events of the night before, chalking them up to exhaustion and overactive imagination. She busied herself with her routine, determined to restore a sense of normalcy. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and the doll's presence in her home weighed on her like a dark cloud. By evening, she resolved to rid herself of the doll. She packed it in a box and drove to the edge of town, where a small antique shop stood. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Draycott, greeted her with a warm smile that quickly faded when Ella placed the box on the counter. "Where did you get this?" Mrs. Draycott asked, her voice hushed. A customer brought it to me for repairs, Ella explained. But I can't keep it. Something about it feels wrong. Mrs. Draycott carefully unwrapped the doll, her hands trembling. This isn't just any doll, she murmured. It's an effigy doll. They were used in old rituals to trap malevolent spirits. Destroying one can release whatever's inside. Ella's stomach churned. Why would someone give this to me? Mrs. Draycott shook her head. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they wanted to pass the burden to someone else. Returning home, Ella felt the weight of Mrs. Draycott's words pressing down on her. She couldn't leave the doll at the shop. It didn't feel right. But keeping it in her house felt even worse. As night fell, the unease in her home grew palpable. The lights flickered intermittently, and faint whispers seemed to echo from unseen corners. At midnight, the knocking returned, this time at every door and window. Ella froze in the middle of her living room, clutching the doll. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they coalesced into a single voice. La mienne. Terrified, Ella shouted, Who are you? What do you want? The voice replied, low and chilling, You invited me, Ella, don't you remember? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning of the voice's words. She hadn't invited anyone, or had she? Memories of her grandmother's stories surfaced, tales of spirits bound to objects, and the rituals used to summon or banish them. The doll's expression seemed to shift in her hands, its glass eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The air grew colder, and a shadow began to stretch across the floor, growing larger and darker until it seemed to consume the room. Ella's phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling her. Picking it up, she saw an unread message from an unknown number. Midnight is the threshold. If you let it in, it will stay forever. Ella's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the message on her phone. Midnight. The word carried an ominous weight, echoing in her mind as the house seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was 11:59. The knocking at the doors and windows grew louder, more urgent, and a voice, now unmistakably inhuman, resonated from all around her. Let me in, Ella. You've already begun. The doll in her hands felt unnaturally warm, as though it pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. Its eyes, once dull and lifeless, now glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light of the room. The shadow on the floor thickened, coiling and writhing like a living thing. Ella's mind raced, trying to recall her grandmother's stories. Midnight is the threshold. If you let it in, it will stay forever. What did that mean? Had she already crossed some unseen boundary? The clock chimed, its deep tones cutting through the oppressive silence. Midnight had arrived. Suddenly, the shadow on the floor surged upward, forming a towering figure. It was faceless yet humanoid, its outline flickering like smoke. The doll in Ella's hands twitched violently, and a guttural sound escaped its tiny, porcelain mouth. Ella, the voice said, now emanating from the shadow itself. You're the last. The binding is undone. I am free. She stumbled backward, clutching the doll tightly as the figure advanced. Her thoughts were a chaotic blur, but one memory surfaced with startling clarity, her grandmother's old saying. To bind what was unbound, sacrifice what was kept. Ella's eyes darted to the fireplace, where the flames danced weakly. It was a gamble, but it was the only option she had. With trembling hands, she hurled the doll into the fire. The porcelain cracked and blackened, and an ear-piercing screech filled the room. The shadow writhed violently, its form fracturing and splintering as though it were being torn apart. The room was engulfed in a blinding light, and for a moment, everything was still. When the light faded, the shadow was gone, and the doll lay in the ashes, its lifeless form split into jagged pieces. Ella sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The air in the house felt lighter, the oppressive presence lifted. She glanced at the clock, 12:01. Midnight had passed. But as she stared at the remnants of the doll, a final detail caught her eye, a single, glowing shard in the ashes, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The words of the voice echoed in her mind, "You've already begun." The silence that filled the house was profound, broken only by the faint crackle of the dying embers in the fireplace. Ella sat on the floor, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind racing with questions. Was it over? Had she truly banished whatever malevolent force had taken hold of her life? The shard in the ashes pulsed faintly, its dim light casting strange patterns on the walls. Ella couldn't bring herself to touch it. Instead, she found a small metal tin and carefully scooped the shard inside, sealing it tightly. She placed the tin in her workshop, locking the door behind her. She decided to leave the house for the night, needing the comfort of people and light. Driving to a nearby diner that stayed open late, she nursed a cup of coffee while the events of the night replayed in her mind. Was the doll merely a vessel? Had the shadow truly been destroyed? And if it wasn't, what would come next? The faint sound of laughter from a group of teenagers in a booth and the clink of dishes in the kitchen brought Ella a small measure of comfort. The mundane, ordinary world outside her house felt safe, grounding her in reality. When Ella returned home the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, banishing any lingering shadows. The house felt ordinary again, quiet and unremarkable. She cleaned the remnants of the doll from the fireplace, discarding the pieces in a bag that she took far out of town to dispose of. For days, life returned to a fragile semblance of normal. Ella resumed her work in the workshop, carefully avoiding the locked door where the shard remained. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the events of that night were only the beginning. Late one evening, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She hesitated before picking it up. The screen displayed a message from an unknown number. "You can't bury what's bound to rise again." Her heart sank. In the stillness of the room, she felt it again, the faint sensation of being watched, of shadows stretching just a little too far. She stared out the window into the darkness beyond, where the faint outline of a figure seemed to stand, unmoving. The house remained silent, but Ella knew deep down that she was not alone. Ella turned off the bedside lamp, sinking into the quiet of her room. Yet, as she closed her eyes, the faint tap-tap of a knock echoed from somewhere deep in the house, soft, persistent, and waiting. And in the shadows beyond the window, the midnight visitor stood watching, patient and unyielding, as if time itself had no meaning.